It's time for us to begin. Who has a microphone tonight? Chuck? John Dean? Just two?
Should be one more.
Just John, you and Chuck are the only ones. Heath.
He saw it. He
Look
went
what he
somewhere else.
did.
Yeah.
Jason's got it now. Wow.
Got to be careful where you sit around here.
Yeah.
That's a good reason we shouldn't always sit in the same place.
Yeah.
Move around a little bit.
We are on lesson 12, which is the last crucial conversation lesson. And we're going to try to wrap things up tonight. We're going to start off with a prayer. And John, will you lead us in a prayer? And we'll get into discussion.
God, we are grateful for you. We're grateful for your word and your message and the way you left it to us. We are grateful for hearing it at some point in our lives. We're grateful for the hearts that you gave us, that we would turn from our ways and look to follow your ways. God, help us tonight as we look to what you've given us, look to your message, look to this book we're also looking at with how we converse with people. And God, we want to be gentle and kind with our voice and our hearts toward everyone in this world. And we know that speaking and talking is a big part of that. And we all aim and look to get better at that. And we just want you to know we want your guidance tonight as we look to sharpen our skills for your kingdom. In your Son's name, amen.
Amen. All right, so here's your Slido joining. And we're going to have one right out of the gate, so you want to go ahead and join in. Kind of entertaining to see all the adults with their phones up. Here we go. What are some ways you can reach a final decision? We kind of talked about these last week, so this is a little bit of a review question to get us started. But what are some different ways that you can make a decision?
We went through it pretty quickly, but we did cover it, so we'll touch on that again.
SWOT analysis.
Oh, no, not that.
Yeah, that's not one of the 4 ways. There we go, consensus. There we go. Vote. Somebody's reviewing their book, which is good. You took notes. Command. Yeah, there's...
Looking for one more.
Yep, one more. Some people typing now. Flip a coin. There's that. Yeah. The other before you. Okay. Flip a coin. Do I?
I like that.
Yeah. Collaborate.
Make things a lot easier.
Yeah. Do we mark this guy or not? Agreement. Collaborate is real close to the other one. Same idea. Consensus is, or consultation, consultation. And so just to quickly go over the 4 the book mentions, and those are all great answers, except for perhaps flip a coin. Command, consultation, vote, and consensus. And which of those is the preferred method? Which of those is found in Acts 15? What's that? Ultimately, for everything. I mean, ultimately, even you want consensus regardless of how you get to the agreement. So I'll give an example of, we talked about sometimes consultation. There's times when my kids will get to give input, but I'm ultimately going to make the decision. Once I make that decision, we'd like consensus still. Like that's the ultimate goal. Now, as a general rule, while there are times for some of these things, consensus is the goal overall. Even you take the idea of a vote and the way we choose a leader. Wouldn't it be great if there was 100% consensus behind one leader in our country? Like, that would never happen. But that would be preferred, right? That would be the preference of everybody, I think. And so ultimately, and especially in the context of this class, what we're trying to get to with as many people involved as possible is we want consensus at the end of the day. We want everybody in agreement. Now, go ahead, John.
I was just going to say consensus allows for the most input from the most people. Kind of the illustration we've been using to kind of add their water to the bucket, to the pool.
Yeah.
Command really doesn't allow for any of that. Vote doesn't really allow for that. Consultation maybe a little bit. So consensus is the most time-consuming and often the most difficult to achieve. But you end up with a better result with that as well.
Yeah, and the big negative with consensus is that it's time-consuming, just that it's going to take more time. Sometimes it'd be easier to just go in and vote. What's the problem with voting? I mean, sure, you could just go in and vote and be done with it, majority rules, but what's the problem with that? Yeah, if you're split down the middle, that's a pretty divisive way to do things. Could be. Yep.
John?
Yep, secretive. Here's another issue we didn't talk about last week, but technically that's not the way God said to make decisions like in the church, is it? At the end of the day, He put a minority in that role. Now, we would still like to get consensus, but in fact, what's implied in places like 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 is that the majority of members probably aren't qualified to make some of those decisions, which is interesting. That's one of the big issues, by the way. I think when churches don't have elders and they go to a business meeting, it always ends up in a vote, and what ends up happening is you get people making decisions that aren't qualified to be elders, so you're basically empowering unqualified men to lead through the voting process. And that's a pretty difficult thing. So we're going to move on and finish up the last section of the last lesson just real quick and talk about the plan. And there's some things, Jonathan's going to go over these, but some things that have to be in place once a decision is made.
So once we have a plan, what do? We got to do something with it, don't we? We have to put that plan into place. We have to act on that decision that's been made. And there's really 4 points that the book makes. First is who. Who is involved in this? So who will be responsible for carrying out the decision, for making sure that that action is done when that is made? So in Acts 15, what do we see? Do we see somebody named to carry out those actions, to carry out the message? Who is that? I mean, do they just come to a decision in Acts 15 and keep all the information to themselves? What do they do? Yeah, in verse 25, it seems good to us, having come to one accord, so they've come to a consensus, to choose men and to send them with you with our beloved Barnabas and Paul. And in verse 27, we have therefore sent Judas and Silas, who themselves will tell you these same things by the words of their mouths. So they have appointed those to share that message, to carry that out. Then once the decision's been made, those people have been identified, what specifically are they being tasked to do? They're not given a general authority or a general job. But again, in Acts 15, what specifically are they empowered to do?
What's the message these 4 guys are supposed to give? That's the question.
Yeah, they deliver the decision. They're specifically empowered and authorized to share that decision. The fourth piece of that, the third piece of that is to have a deadline or a goal. So, tattling on myself a little bit, who's bad about procrastinating? Yeah, right. Especially if there's not a set deadline or a goal. When there's something this important, we always need to have a goal in mind, a deadline in mind, to have something done, but especially when it's something like this, that concerns someone's soul, their salvation. We have to act on that, need to make that a priority. And then we need to follow up. We need to be accountable to make sure that the proper message has been shared, that deadline has been met, that everything that's been discussed and talked about has been carried out. So we have to know who is doing it, what specifically they're doing, when they're doing it, and then we follow up to make sure that it was done.
It's really important anytime there's some solution reached, right, that it's actually followed through, because things don't get followed through and they're just kind of left on the decision-making table, then that's not success. So let's talk, as we kind of wrap up the book, one of the things that we talked about all this process, but let's talk about the practice of it for just a moment. One of the four authors, Patterson, made the observation that they surveyed people that had read this book. And it was pretty interesting that they asked how many people benefited, and a great majority of them benefited. But what they also found out is that a majority of those who benefited didn't actually finish the book. They didn't read the whole book. In fact, they just kind of skimmed the titles and kind of looked through, but said it still helped them. Now, how do you think that's possible, by the way? How is it possible that somebody can claim the book helped them out, but they didn't even really read it?
I think you can, as you skim through the book, you can recognize your weak points, your areas that you need to work on, and you have that aha moment and realize, okay, I'm going to integrate or implement this in my next conversation in order to improve the outcome.
Yep, I agree with that. Anybody else? Anybody else? I think part of this is like just recognition of the process. During the quarter, have you ever heard us talk about something, or we talk about something here and you kind of go, this isn't that hard? Or as one of my interns once said, it's not rocket surgery. That's the way he said that.
But it's also things we've all been through.
Yeah.
We've all been in these situations, and even just skimming through the book, we can look at it and say, okay, yeah, I recognize this. I recognize the turn. I recognize the emotion. And it's easy to take away, okay, here's what I should do different without getting into too much detail.
Yeah, at the end of the day, this process is kind of intuitive. Like, these are all things we know. Like, for instance, we know we should not get hostile in a conversation. We know that's counter-effective. And how many of you know that being hostile and violent in a verbal discussion is a bad thing? How many of you know that before this class? Right? How many of you still do it anyway? Right? Like, we know that it's wrong. We know it's bad. And so sometimes just because people skim through here, they just kind of see the highlights and they kind of go, oh, yeah, these are important things. So our goal has been just to kind of not even give you new tools as much as just remind you of the tools that you know you have. My dad was real bad about when he needed a tool for a project, going and buying it before he looked for it. And then, you know, that's how you end up with 5 ratchet sets, by the way. And so it's one of those deals where these are tools that you have already. We're just trying to remind you of that. A quick true-false question on Slido. Crucial conversations are easy to manage. This should be an easy one. True or false? They're easy to manage. I have no true people here. Nobody's going to be bold to say true. In the high school class, what they do is one of them answers the other way just to be contrary. There we go. There's somebody that says true.
If somebody would do it.
I would say false. And here's why. I just don't do a good job at it. This is probably the 3rd or 4th time I've read this book. First time I've taught it in this setting, but these aren't new skills for me, and I still fail at them. One of the issues with that is, by the way, that when you're in these conversations, everything is literally going like 100 miles an hour. There is things being said, and they're being said in certain ways. And if you think about what we've talked about, I mean, in this whole time you're sitting there, if Jonathan and I are in this conversation, I'm supposed to be listening to what he says. I'm supposed to be watching his nonverbal cues while listening to his tone and his verbal cues, taking in the data without interpreting it into a story, breathing and calming down and being patient and kind, and making sure, watching for the turn, making it safe. I'm supposed to do all of this stuff while he's talking.
Meanwhile, I'm probably not doing that.
I don't know, but, and when it's my turn to talk, you're supposed to do that. And there's also this idea, by the way, that we're just programmed for no pregnant pauses. So as soon as he starts to take a breath, or I think he's done, it's my turn to talk. And so half of what I'm doing is waiting for that cue to jump in and say something. There's a lot going on. And that's why these conversations are really hard, is because it's like being on an interstate of information, and you're trying to direct traffic in a sense, and it's impossible. Dave?
I think the two most difficult parts is managing yourself and your response and how you emotion, but not only managing internally and how you respond, but also externally and how you're making assumptions about their motives or where they're going with it. And that's always dangerous. Instead of just asking the question, I'm having a hard time following you. I'd like to understand this better. And doing some of the techniques from the book that kind of make it a better outcome for sure.
Absolutely.
It's something that requires use and practice, right? And we're not going to get it overnight. Like to Terry's point, he's been through this multiple times. Most of us, this is our first time through it. But you alluded to driving a minute ago. So when you take a 15-year-old that's just learning to drive, the first time you take them out and you go jump on 280 or 65 during rush hour.
No.
Is that what you do? No, because there's too much going on. It's overload, right? You got to take it bit step by step and build upon the skills as we go. And it's the same thing with this. We can't expect to perfect it. But if we don't use it, we don't try, we're never going to get it.
There's two things I would suggest that you focus on above all others, and that's two things we've talked about a lot, but one of them is to just constantly be watching for the turn in yourself and in the other person. And the only thing that you can do when you see the things start to turn is control yourself, right? So that's the main thing, is you watch for the turn, and along with that, you just be committed to making it safe. Always making it a safe conversation for that person. And you've got to develop those two skills, really, I think, before you can do all the other things that we've talked about. And so the other thing is that this is an ongoing growing process. We had several passages you were asked in this lesson to kind of look at, and but one of those was 1 Peter chapter 2. And you may not think of this passage this way, but kind of want you to think of it this way. So put away all malice and deceit and hypocrisy and envy and slander. So it's easy to look at that and go, well, yeah, I don't need to use those things in my conversations. But then verse 2, like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, that by it you may grow up into salvation, and if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. The implication of those last two verses is that as a disciple, you're in this continual growth process. You're to always and I think what's interesting in verse 2 is I think sometimes we read this the wrong way. We think this passage is about new converts because it says as newborn infants. But really what he says there in verse 2 is for them to be like newborn infants and desire the word. And the point there is that regardless of how long you've been a student of the word, a disciple, a Christian, you should be desiring more and to grow more, just like an infant desires that next feeding. And that's the idea here. This isn't a passage just about newborn Christians. This is about the desire all of us should have. And it's interesting to say, if you've tasted the Lord is good. Listen, if you know God is good, then you should be desiring more of that all the time. You should crave that and pursue that. And in the same sense, what we've talked about in this whole quarter is biblical principles. The book's not a biblically based book, but the principles it teaches are all biblically based principles, which is what's interesting. Good behavior often can be found in Scripture. And so we need to desire to grow in this area and in these things so that we can continue to do that. So
It's interesting that so much of what we've talked about is mirrored in God's Word.
yeah.
That as Christians, all this really should be intuitive for us. That we see as, okay, yeah, that makes sense. I do need to control myself.
If you go and look at some of the most successful leadership books on the shelves today, you'll find them rooted in biblical principles, whether they admit that or not, which is what's really interesting. Last Slido here is, do you think the tools we learned this quarter will work to manage your conversations better? Do you think they will work? Gave you a couple different choices there. This time, mixed it up a little bit.
Got a mix of answers this time.
We do have a mix of answers. We have a bold no up there. We no longer have a bold no up there.
We need a defend your answer session.
I think one of the things that's really interesting is the 15% that says depends on the other person. Now 20%. There's a part of that where I would agree that's true, but I think that we need to be careful that that doesn't become our excuse to behave poorly. That sometimes, if we're not careful, and I can say I've been guilty of this, where I go into conversation thinking, this isn't going to work because I know this guy. So I've already told myself a story before we've even sat down to talk. And you know what I found out is that if I'll come into a situation with an open mind and objective, a lot of times I find out, A, I'm wrong about that person, and B, we're a lot closer than I ever thought. And so that's important. The bold no is back, by the way. The Sage Spear is my guy who does this to me, by the way, in the high school class. He's the one that keeps moving the entire time. So I would blame Jared, but he's not here. So
Yeah, I would generally agree with the responses. I mean, yes, these will work. Ultimately, though, as the book points out, this isn't magic. It's not manipulation. And it does require at least two parties to be actively trying to come to a resolution. But to Terry's point, we have to be trying. We can't give up on somebody before we start. We're never going to get anywhere.
Yep. Yeah, that's the first thing on this back page you may have. And I think, Jonathan, that's yours, but there's just no magic bullet. Go ahead. I'll leave you.
Oh, yeah, I like how one of the writers put it, that if we do everything in this book exactly the way they tell us to do it, and the other person does not want to dialogue with us, dialogue won't take place. Ultimately, the other person has the ability to choose whether or not they're going to respond to our efforts. So there's no process, no formula, nothing we can do that's going to resolve every situation, every issue. It's just not going to happen. But what this does is it gives us tools to put us in a better place and gives us a better chance to have that dialogue and to resolve any conflict that we have and come to an agreement with those that we're disagreeing with.
Yeah, I think in one of the passages you have is Romans 12, which is an interesting passage because if you just go through there and you just list all the things you think might go along with this, well, Bless those who don't curse you. Live in harmony. Repay no one evil for evil. Do what's honorable. Live peaceably. Don't avenge. Take care of your enemy. Overcome evil with good. But one of the things we kind of overlook with that is just the truth of that passage is there's going to be conflict.
And it tells us how to respond to that conflict. I like the verse 21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Isn't that what we're talking about? Is not allowing evil or somebody else's emotions to overcome us in these dialogues. We do control ourselves.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting to think about the fact that the scriptures teach us to pursue unity, but then almost admit unity is going to be an ongoing pursuit because you're always going to run into some situation where there's going to be a breakdown. Broken people cause brokenness, and hurt people hurt people. We've heard that before. So when you put a bunch of people in with their buckets, it's inevitable sometimes that something's going to go wrong, something's going to get said, and how you respond is a big deal to that. I think that's pretty important to kind of keep in mind from that standpoint.
Talked about, an example that comes to mind is business meetings, which you all kind of cringe when we think about that. But I can remember being in meetings that were rather contentious. And I still remember one or two people who I always knew were going to be the voice of reason in those discussions and be the ones to kind of mediate and settle everybody down. And it has an impact not only on those involved, but has far-reaching consequences for this decision that's reached as well.
Yeah. Also, in the Sermon on the Mount, what did Jesus say about how we treat our enemies? Matthew 5. What did he say about treating your enemies? How we respond to our enemies?
You double up, you give them the shirt off your back, you go the extra mile.
You love them, yeah. And in fact, he compares, he says there, he says, if you love those who love you, who does he compare that to? Yeah, you're no different than the tax collectors, the people they look down upon. The worst people around us love the people who love them. Right? And so if we only get along with people who get along with us, what that really means is the gospel's not changed us, just to be quite honest. Because we're just acting like the world at that point. And I know that's blunt and direct, but that's just the truth. I mean, part of what the gospel is supposed to do is change our lives in such a way that we stick out. And that's one of the best ways this is accomplished is how we treat people who mistreat us. And Jesus was the ultimate example of that, wasn't he? Jesus is getting nailed to the cross and forgiving those people. And I tell you what's interesting to me is I point that out to some people, and they make that he's the exception and talk about how they don't have to forgive somebody unless they ask for forgiveness. No, I hate to tell you this if that's your position on that. When you think you don't have to forgive people who don't ask for forgiveness, you're no different than the rest of the world. You're not Christ-like at that point. What made Jesus different, what made Stephen different as he imitated Jesus, is here's people that are killing them who are not asking for forgiveness, and they beg God to forgive those people because of their ignorance. That's just so. All that to say, there's no magic bullet, but love people who get upset with you. Scott, you had your hand up.
I was just really going to say kind of what you just said there, Tim. I mean, there is no magic bullet, but Jesus is the ultimate example, and all of us need to obviously aspire to that example. And, to me, in crucial conversations, and I'm a failure at many of them, the ability to sit back and listen to someone has in my past and oftentimes even now a big failure for me, and not speak before them or whatever the case may be. So I think listening is a really, really big part that we have to, if you don't have that mentality or that gift or however you want to say that, you really got to practice it. And you got to stop yourself and you've got to pause and really make yourself listen. Because if you're willing to listen, then that is what opens the conversation up, you know, for other people to feel comfortable with you, even though the things that you say may be difficult, you know. The other thing I was going to say was, you know, that little Slido you had up there, and it was talking about, it depends on the subject, depends on the person, you know, whatever, the person you're talking to, whatever. The reality is this. To me, the overall conversation may not be successful with the other person, but if you have been willing to engage it properly, you've taken the steps to engage the difficult situation, and the other person turns the cheek and goes the other way and doesn't want to listen to you, not turns the cheek in a good sense, but in a bad sense, and it doesn't want to address it, at least you've taken the step to try to solve the issue. I'm not saying you stop there. You may continue. But the thing that I have found over time with dealing with people at work, especially, and things of that nature, is I kind of became known as a person that people would talk to because I was willing to deal with the difficult discussions, you know. And a lot of people didn't want to, and they would walk out the room. That's fine, but at least be willing. And I think that really is a big part of it because it grows you. Okay, it really grows who you are, and you know, I think that's a big deal to people, and to God. I think that's what He wants us to do. He wants us to do that, engage with people in their difficult circumstances, whatever they may be.
Yeah, I think you make a great point. Your success, personally, is not dependent on their response. And by the way, that's a really important thing when it comes to evangelism, because we tend to think that evangelism is only successful when somebody gets in the water. And Jesus taught that evangelism is successful whenever the word's taught, regardless of the response. So we've got to be less. The problem is, from an early age, we are taught to look at what we produce. We're production-based. We look at numbers and results. In some of these areas, that's not what it is. Let's move on for a little bit, and we can maybe get some good discussion here. So don't give up too quickly. A lot of time what happens is in the middle of these conversations, you get a little frustrated, things start to turn, you see the turn coming, and you just throw your hands up and quit. And you give up. Three of the passages that you were to read and look at, Hebrews 12:14, Romans 14:19, and Ephesians 4:3, all talk about doing what? Anybody do that and take any notes? Hebrews 12:14, Romans 14:19, and Ephesians 4:3. You did your lesson, made notes. What did they all have in common? John?
Peace, unity.
Yep, pursuing peace. They have the idea in there of pursuit of peace. Now, when you think about pursuing, what do you think about? Yeah, I think about a couple things. I think of, oddly enough, Roscoe saying he's in hot pursuit of the Duke boys, because that's when I grew up. Okay. Yep, I'm in hot pursuit. The other one I think about is dating. When you start dating somebody, you pursue them. What does that look like? Joe has this look on his face like he's trying to remember. That was an easy target.
And Karen has a look like he better remember.
Not working.
It's kind of a situation where
You don't give up. What's that? Takes time.
Next time.
And is it always easy? Like, anybody's dating process go super easy? Like, you'd asked her out and she's like, will you please marry me? Anybody go through that? It's, oh, Charlie and Jane? Yeah. You asked him to marry you after the first date? Or? Oof. That's sweet. It took me 5 years to get Duane to say yes to one date, so that wasn't that easy. Yeah. She paid for that mistake. Listen, when you decide that this is the person for you, you keep pursuing them. You don't give up. And that's the same idea with this idea of peace. And I just got to tell you, I'm not sure that I've always pursued peace with the same dedication and commitment I pursued my wife. And we should. That's the same idea here. But now that we're married, if a conversation goes difficultly, we just throw our hands up and like, well, we can't have these tough conversations. I just can't talk to her about anything. Or if you talk to the elders and it doesn't go like you want to go, you just throw your hands up and quit and say, well, I can't talk to the elders. They're impossible to talk to. That's not the idea of pursuing peace, Dave.
I think part of the components of that pursuit are desire and love.
Yeah.
And the problem is, it's easy for me to love certain people that have personality traits that I like. It's not easy for personality traits that I don't like at all. So that desire and that love are lacking. And so that's things that we all have to work on, is even the person, I mean, Scripture's pretty clear, love our enemies. And so that's a lot easier said than done. We've got a lot of work on our hearts in order to make that something a reality.
We need to move on. I'll say this about don't give up too quickly. A big part of that is 1 Corinthians 3:7, which the idea to take from there is that I have to force myself to always think the best of other people. I have to force myself to think the best of whoever the conflict's with. What ends up happening, though, is I usually think the worst and judge their intentions in the harshest manner possible and turn myself into a victim to make them the bad person. And that's the opposite. And that's part of, by the way, the fight or flight reaction to these kind of things and justifying yourself to give up is what that is. So third thing.
Yeah, if I can't force change on someone else or an agreement or a dialogue from someone else, what can I do? I can control me, right? I can control what I do and what I say and where my heart's at, even if I can't control someone else. So I may not be able to change you or change your mind, but I can take care of my own self. And so part of that is looking in the mirror and asking myself, what is my motivation? Where are my emotions at? What is my story? Am I telling myself a story about this person or about this conversation that we're trying to have? And most of the time, if I am telling myself a story, I'm going to be wrong because I haven't opened that dialogue with the other person to have their input, to allow them to add their water to the pool, right? So I'm missing part of that. We spent a whole lesson just about talking about telling stories. And that is such a dangerous place to be.
I think it was 2 lessons.
Two
as
lessons,
a matter of fact.
yeah.
Huge emphasis.
So it all starts with me. Before I ever have that conversation, check myself. Denise? Absolutely. Great point. And part of that is making sure that what I have to say to the other person is appropriate for who they are and what their situation is and where they are spiritually. It's going to be a different conversation with different people.
One of the things that is really important when Duane and I talk to married couples when they have issues is usually one of them will come in. They've come to us because they're so frustrated, because most of them know us. So to have the courage to break down that wall and to actually come in and say, okay, we're having problems, means that one of them is really at the end of their rope. When they come in, one of the things that they'll often say is that they just think that this person, there's no hope for this person. One of the things you got to remember is when you've got so invested in your story that you think somebody has no hope, that's a good sign you've probably told yourself a story that's a lie. Because the reality is there's hope for everybody. And when we think that it's hopeless for one person, especially a person in that case that you once claimed to love, and now you're deeming them unredeemable, then you need to really take a long look at yourself. That's a dangerous place to be in.
Those who we see as being the most hopeless are the ones that need hope the most of the time. You look at who Jesus talked to. He was criticized for the crowd that he kept and the people that he surrounded himself with. Why? It's those are the people who needed him, who needed help.
And I'm reminded of, I think it's in 1 Corinthians where it talks about the body parts that are weaker are worthy of more honor. And that's the opposite of how we look at that from that standpoint. Last thing is to begin at the right place. Everybody knows the answer to this, I hope, but how do you eat an elephant? Heard that before? Eat an elephant. One bite at a time. Right? And the point of that, there's been books by that title, which is a weird thing. The point of that is we look at this elephant as this massive thing. How are we going to do that? And it's the same way you eat anything. It's one bite at a time. You have to start small on what we've talked about this quarter. You cannot, I think I've told the story about, there was a couple, I preached a lesson on marriage, and there was a guy that went home and he decided he was going to take that first lesson in the whole series and fix his wife in 1 week, and told her it meant that whatever he told her she had to get up and do. And he came and told me, he actually is bold enough to come and thank me for the sermon and told me what he told her. And I looked at him and said, that's the exact opposite of what I was saying. Like, you weren't listening to anything that I said. You can't go home this week and decide that you're going to fix everything, let's say in your relationship with somebody, whether it's your boss, somebody at church, your spouse. You can't go and determine that you're going to take what we learned this quarter and you're going to fix it this week. Like, that doesn't work that way. In fact, that's against everything that we've kind of been talking about. Always start small, work on small things, build on those things. And at the same time, one of the things I want to point out about beginning at the right place is to begin today. Whatever relationship you have that maybe you think is broken and you need to have a conversation about, probably has a lot of history that comes along with it. It is not profitable to go back in history and drudge all of that up and then try to have a crucial conversation that's effective.
Where it gets emotional.
Yeah, because you're teeing up their emotions and giving them all the reasons to get either silent or violent because of what you've done. Don't do that. Start small, begin today, try to create dialogue. In that list of passages, 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 and 5, 1 Thessalonians 5, 2 Timothy 2, Ephesians 4, Colossians 3, and verses 12 and 13. All of those verses have the idea of patience, or bearing with one another, or not being easily provoked. All of those passages that you were supposed to read through in preparation for tonight talk about kindness, not all of them, but kindness, compassion, patience, meekness, gentleness. Those are the qualities we're supposed to have and how we're supposed to respond to other people. And so when I'm tempted to give up on a conversation, I need to ask myself quickly, have I been long-suffering with this person? Have I been patient? Have I been kind? Can I try harder? What can I do that will be better in this situation?
Yeah. I think one of the key things to remember is that as much as what we say, what we do, how we act toward that other person has as much impact in that resolution as anything. Words are important. Words are how we express ourselves. But how we act and how we conduct ourselves, if we do it with love and with patience, we're going to get a lot farther than coming at somebody with anger or any other negative emotion.
Any other final comments, questions, thoughts? Anybody? A couple of housekeeping things. In the back, there's 2 books. A week from Sunday will be, well, a week from tonight is when the Wednesday night quarter starts. It's a little bit odd this time. We start on a Wednesday instead of a Sunday. And that book will be Following the Messiah. Real important thing is you'll open it up to lesson 14, and that's because we did the first 13 lessons last year, and it starts on page 83. This is a 26 lesson set of material that we've just split into 2 quarters.
I will note that book might be longer than our Jeremiah book was.
Yeah, that book is pretty lengthy, but it has moving pictures, so bonus. The second book is Cross-Shaped Lives. That's going to be on Sunday morning. That will not start until a week from Sunday. This Sunday, during our class time, will be a congregational meeting. Just so happened we had 14 Sundays this quarter, and our material's 13 Sundays long. So we had an extra Sunday, and we've kind of needed to have this congregational kind of style meeting for a while. So I say that to say sometimes we kind of check out and come late because we think that's not a big deal. Don't do that. Come in and be a part of that Sunday morning and know what's going on and have a proper understanding of what 2024 is going to look like. Some of the things we'll go over there are all of our classes for next year and our sermon themes and some other important things. So make sure you can be here Sunday morning at 9:30 for that. Pick up the books. We're a few books short tonight on the Cross-Shaped Lives just because we've ordered more coils and they're at Brandon's house and he's old and forgetful and did not bring them. So you can give him a hard time about that. And we'll have the rest of those by Sunday. So thanks again for the quarter, and we'll see you Sunday morning.
Thanks, everybody.